I am continuing in my reading. What I'm doing in this series is to read through the entire standard works of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This consists of the Bible, the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, and the Pearl of Great Price. I am continuing reading in a chronological order, according to event, not according to publication or volume, so I'm skipping around a bit as I move along. I am continuing in the Gospels. We are down to the wire. We're at the last few days just before the atonement. The triumphal entry was about 3 or 4 days earlier, maybe, and we've had a lot of contentions with the Jews. He's finally silenced all the Pharisees and those who would kill him. Put them to silence. And the last thing we read was in Matthew a scathing rebuke of the Pharisees. Just one of the most, basically calling the Pharisees sons of perdition. Not using that specific term, but that's what he was saying. We read that in Matthew. Now we are going to read in Mark and in Luke. In this video, we have a Joseph Smith translation. Now what the Joseph Smith translation is, this is a translation or correction done by Joseph Smith to restore those passages that have been lost or corrupted over the years. Mark chapter 12, verses 38 through 40. And he said unto them in his doctrine, Beware of the scribes, which love to go in long clothing, and love salutations in the marketplaces, and the chief seats in the synagogues, and the uppermost rooms at the feasts, which devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayers. These shall receive greater damnation. Not quite the scathing rebuke that we read in Matthew, but, this is Mark's recounting what Christ said in Matthew and how he is condemning this. Here's just the scribes, and Matthew is the Pharisees and the scribes. But it's really it's the same message, extremely condensed. This is only 3 verses. Matthew had 39. But he's calling out their hypocrisy again and saying they are going to receive the greater condemnation because of it. But we don't really get any detail there. Let us look at the Joseph Smith translation quickly. Well, in 38, instead of and love salutations, it is and have salutations. And then in 40, instead of which devour widows' houses, it is who devour widows' houses. Minor grammatical changes, nothing of real substance. So now let us briefly read in Luke chapter 20, verses 45 to 47. Then in the audience of all the people he said unto his disciples, Beware of the scribes, which desire to walk in long robes, and love greetings in the markets, and the highest seats in the synagogues, and the chief rooms at feasts, which devour widows' houses, and for a shew make long prayers. The same shall receive greater damnation. Again, not quite the scathing rebuke that we read in Matthew, but this is almost word for word the same as we read in Mark. Just another reiterating of the same rebuke in a much more condensed version. But nothing new there. So we're going to just look at the Joseph Smith translation. And what do we have here? In 46, instead of which desire, it is who desire. And in 47, instead of which devour, it is who devour. Very minor grammatical corrections, nothing of note. Well, this video turned out to be a lot shorter than I was expecting. And so now I'm going to read our next story as part of the same video. And this is again going to be in Mark and Luke. So we turn to Mark chapter 12, verses 41 to 44. And Jesus sat over against the treasury, and beheld how the people cast money into the treasury. And many that were rich cast in much. And there came a certain poor widow, and she threw in 2 mites, which make a farthing. And he called unto him his disciples, and saith unto them, Verily I say unto you, that this poor widow hath cast more in than all they which have cast into the treasury. For all they did cast in of their abundance, but she of her want did cast in all that she had, even all her living. The mite is one of the smallest bronze coins of the New Testament era. Now, I'm not going to get into a lot of detail on New Testament coins right now, but that's what it is. It's worth very little. It'll be like pennies to us. So in the modern day, you might say a widow donated all of her retirement, all of her Social Security check. She gave the whole thing, even though all she has is that little bit, while others are donating thousands upon thousands. And that's what it's the willingness to give all that Christ is commending here. If a wealthy man who had millions donated millions, well then he would be equal to the widow's mite, because it would be all. The widow gave probably 95% of her income. The rich men were giving 10%. That's why the widow was commended here. Not because of the amount of money she gave, but of the relative percent of her income that she gave. And today, we're only required to pay 10% in tithing. That's the requirement. And to give a generous fast offering. But there are so many programs in the church that we can donate to, so many ways that we can consecrate our money to the work of the Lord, that if we chose, we could give, like the widow here did. We could give much more than just that 10%. The 10% is the baseline. That's the minimum. But God and the church has made it very easy for us to give all. But let us look at the Joseph Smith translation here for Mark. In verse 41, it now opens, and after this, Jesus sat over against the treasury. So it is after his contending with the Jews. Same day, in other words. In verse 42, it now has, instead of she threw in, it is she cast in. Verse 43 now reads, and Jesus called his disciples and said unto them, and then at the end we change which to who. And in verse 44, it now reads, for all the rich did cast in of their abundance, but she, notwithstanding her want, did cast in all that she had, yea, even all her living. Doesn't change the meaning, but it is much better grammatically, flows a little better. But now let us look at this in Luke chapter 21, verses 1 through 4. And he looked up and saw the rich men casting their gifts into the treasury. And he saw also a certain poor widow casting in thither 2 mites. And he said, of a truth I say unto you, that this poor widow hath cast in more than they all. For all these have of their abundance cast in unto the offerings of God. But she of her penury hath cast in all the living that she had. Now there's an interesting word for you. Penury. This is an old archaic term indicating extreme poverty. And so maybe this isn't like the retired widow who still gets her Social Security check, but the homeless person on the street who they might be making $50 a day just to get by, but they make their $50 and then they donate it to the church. That seems to be more along the lines of what is being discussed here. Now let's look at the Joseph Smith translation for Luke. In verse 1, instead of casting their gifts, it's casting in their gifts. And in verse 4, of her penury hath is corrected to has. But that is all, nothing of any grand importance. So now we are going to be leaving this here, and our next video will be in John. So I will see you there.